All right, everyone, we've got extremely interesting news here. It turns out the Neanderthals were not just a bunch of slouches who lived in caves and pointed and grunted at things. It turns out that actually they were the apex of civilization. They invented bone-tipped spears, actually, separate from Homo sapiens. This is something that was remarked upon by science for a very, very long time. They figured the Neanderthals were nothing more than stupid heads that had no culture, and they slowly got absorbed by the much more intelligent Homo sapiens from out of Africa, actually. Turns out that that's not the case. I have long suspected that there was a reasonably advanced civilization in Northern Europe at one time. And then the Ice Age came, and it became totally inhospitable. They had no choice but to flee further and further south, eventually meeting with and landing up with the Homo sapien population down there. They lost elements of their culture and technology at that time because they were forced to live a much more nomadic lifestyle. That is, that they had settled effectively a proto-civilization. We're not talking about death rays and UFOs and stuff like that, but we're talking about people who were reasonably sophisticated, probably had a gestural language in general, had the ability of tool usage, which now has been established as true, evincing my opinion on the subject, and so forth. They separately created a civilization, an organized sort of civilization, something along the lines of a horticulturalist civilization. But then it was destroyed by the Ice Age. And as they moved south, they, of course, genetically speaking, absorbed into the Homo sapiens population, which had better conditions for harvesting, hunter-gathering, and of course for therefore breeding, supplying the caloric intake necessary to create offspring, and they had a greater capacity to breed, it seems. But the Neanderthals ended up creating civilization first. What was there among Homo sapiens at the time that we're talking about here when they were already creating sophisticated tools, sophisticated by the Stone Age, manners, of course. It already existed while Homo sapiens were simply hunter-gatherers. Um, they developed these tools separately, we now know, according to new evidence. Supposedly, when I was a kid, we were taught the Neanderthals were dumb, ugly, basically like a more retarded version of John Fetterman or Ron Perlman, and they just pointed and grunted, lived in caves. They knew about fire, but that's pretty much the extent of their knowledge. Me no fire, me no make fur. Uh, that's basically, the monosyllabic, Neanderthals, cave people, basically where this has been completely upended and a lot of people didn't get the memo. Homo sapiens was much more uncivilized at the time, actually. And we call ourselves Homo sapiens, even though a large proportion of the DNA in part of the world's population comes from that Neanderthal lineage, actually. If you're out of Europe or Asia specifically, and there are areas of higher and lower concentration. In fact, people that were mixed with that DNA were the ones that became the so-called Native Americans, actually. Now, they didn't have a cohesive, full network-style culture. So we're not talking city-states. We're not talking elaborate trade networks and stuff like that. We're still talking about familial tribalism. That being said, obviously, these particular individuals were not capable of existing for tens of thousands of years without having some exonomy, and so they must have had some sort of travel and trade network. They appear to have gotten along with one another, and that's what happened. Same is true of Homo sapiens, of course. Honestly, you should be calling most humans Homo neanderthalensis, actually. It's rather interesting to think about. Your science news of the day, of course. It turns out that the Neanderthals weren't just a bunch of dumbasses. We've been told that, and I know there's a propagandistic reason, especially now, for it. Before it was out of ignorance. It's like, well, they're not actually human. They're of a different lineage. It's interesting that they were clearly humanoid, and could clearly interbreed with Homo sapiens, but they weren't actually human. And they just discounted it out of ignorance. They thought that these were primitives living in caves, using nothing more than sharpened wooden spears and throwing rocks at bears and shit like that. Turns out that's not the case. They had art, they were smoking drugs, they had woodwind instruments, and now we find out that they had bone-tipped spears. Obviously, this is no longer an eco-fact, this is an artifact in nature. We find out they did sewing, they knew how to make clothing, they buried their dead. This was the root of civilization in the world. It was the Neanderthal diaspora influencing other groups of people as it was slowly absorbed that caused civilization to arise. So you had a jump start of other groups of people, technologically and ritualistically speaking, and probably in the conversational sense as well, along with art and other things like that. That jump started what became humanity. It was the Neanderthals. It was not the archaic Homo sapiens, arguably. We're now finding this. These days, though, this particular theory, for which there is more and more evidence, is mainly cast aside by scientists because they don't want to talk about the issue, because it's politically incorrect. It's politically incorrect to suggest that it was a technically European and largely white diaspora entering into other areas and landing up that jump-started civilization. No, no, no. Everything is supposed to have come from Africa. You're not allowed to say that anything positive has ever come from Europe. The only thing Europe exports is diseases and wars, they say. That's the only thing that they create. And therefore, by default, of course, the diaspora that landed in the Americas, we've supposedly done the same thing. There was never an attempt at peace or technological progress. We've added nothing to the world, and we're terrible, terrible monsters. That's basically what you get taught in school now, isn't it? That's about all. Peace out.